A component of League of Legends that's just as intriguing as the history of its champions would have to be the history of its items, being the vehicle in which you grow stronger and gain access to more options and strategies. Items can sometimes be so influential that they lead to new playstyles and champions, or in more extreme cases be the keystone of entire metas. Several channels, myself included, have extensively covered such items like Ardent Censer, Banner of Command, Deathfire Grasp, and how they were so impactful to the game, usually in a negative way, that they had to be significantly changed or outright removed from the game due to how toxic they were. For most players, those items would be the first to come to mind when you think of worst items in League history. But there is one item that, while perhaps not as prevalent if we compare the height of its influence to the aforementioned ones, may have been just as big of a failure, if not more so. For today, we'll be looking at the history of Duskblade of Draktharr, and how, despite literally going through more reworks than any other item, was such a failure that eventually it was deleted from the game entirely. Duskblade was implemented during a very transformative time for League. Seasons 5 through 7 oversaw a period of great renovation as part of an initiative to modernize the game's engine and usher in a new era of League. On top of retrofitting the majority of the champion pool through class-wide reworks, items were also heavily shifted around in an effort to create meaningfully distinct purchases and functions for champions, more specifically by establishing a selection of purposeful attributes, as in items that were dedicated for tanks and tanks only, items for fighters and fighters only, rather than everyone buying everything. A product of this new direction was Duskblade of Draktharr, introduced in version 6.3 right at the start of season 2016. With the Marksman class having received a complete overhaul both in champions but more importantly items, it came at the expense of the Assassin class, who shared multiple purchases with the very class they spent the entire game dispatching, therefore leaving them with few efficient item purchases to rely on, especially for their first and second buys. Duskblade was intended to be the Assassin item, just like how IE is the Marksman item. The first iteration of Duskblade had to have been the most divisive of the 5. On a 2-minute cooldown, your next basic attack on an enemy champion would apply a debuff where, after 2 seconds, they would take a massive chunk of missing health damage, and if you scored a takedown before the detonation, the cooldown would be refreshed. Can I just point out how coincidental it is that I make the history of Duskblade video right around the time we've been at the receiving end of an ability power item very similar to Duskblade when it came out. In any case, to most of you, one look at the item's passive is enough to have your jaw drop. Dealing 90 base plus 25% missing health damage from an item alone sounds profoundly overpowered. That's almost as much damage as some ultimates in the right circumstances, and it was. At the same time, it was very inconsistent in value. The activation condition for Duskblade was to simply land a basic attack on a target, giving you 2 seconds to deal as much damage as you could to maximize the execute that would soon follow. The problem was that Duskblade's backloaded damage was seldom actually be used to its full effect. Conceptually, assassins are the masters of front-loaded damage, also known as burst. The idea is for them to 100 to 0 you within the span of a second or 2 at most, leaving you with almost no time to react and mount a defense. Duskblade inherently contradicted that notion by being placed on a delay, and even though there are times where your target escapes with a sliver of health, in which case that last bit of damage would be helpful, trying to get an ideal scenario like that was easier said than done. What happened was that either A, the assassin would destroy their target without the need for Nightfall, or B, the assassin would prematurely blow Nightfall going for a quick trade or attack, thus putting the item on its deservedly long 2-minute cooldown. The rather niche way in which it worked only really made it usable on the likes of Zed. Duskblade's maiden voyage was by no means perfect, nor was it even all that effective, but it foreshadowed the turbulent future it would have, in that Ryze just couldn't find a good balance between the item being niche enough to allow for build diversity while at the same time being practical enough to justify being purchased. The premise of it was simple enough. They wanted Duskblade to be the more combat-oriented assassin item, while Ghostblade was to serve as the more movement-focused item. It goes without saying that most, if not all, physical damage assassins could weaponize increased tempo, but not everyone cared about backloaded damage, however high an amount it may be. Kha'Zix, Rengar, Old Talon, none of these champions were particularly interested in their victims being alive for more than half a second, leaving only Zed and maybe Shaco to run this item. Although, if I recall, there was brief experimentation with using Duskblade on Nocturne and Wukong, though at this point it was so long ago my memory's escaping me. Following the Assassin rework in pre-season 7, that's when the class as a whole, champions and items were fully reimagined, and with that came Duskblade 2, Electric Boogaloo, effectively replaced with an altogether new effect as a stealth-based item. In addition to wanting to navigate the rift as fast as possible, assassins naturally wanted to be invisible to the enemy team, both figuratively and literally, so to incentivize this and create a bigger distinction between the two items, while Ghostblade helped you move fast, Duskblade helped you move quietly, granting an Oracle Lens effect for 8 seconds after being spotted by a ward. Further driving that stealth point home was the new effect it received, where after being unseen for at least a second, whether by breaking enemy vision or through stealth, your next basic attack would deal a chunk of true damage based on double the lethality you had. which I believe back then you could reach up to like 75 for 50 plus 150 or 200 bonus true damage. Several assassins could efficiently activate this new passive, key of which being Cossacks, whose Void Assault perfectly facilitated that breaking vision clause. But even for chance without stealth, Duskblade granted them a quick burst of unloaded damage on their initial strike, so hopefully that property, coupled with the general vision clearing, would be enough to establish Duskblade as a veritable first option for most AD assassins. Compared to the first one, it definitely was. We started seeing more champions build it, but it still wasn't quite up to par with the likes of Ghostblade in terms of being a first purchase. Duskblade's build path necessitated a BF sword, serrated dirk, and 850 gold flat, making it arguably the worst in terms of build path and one of the most expensive first items in the game. Also, the passive component, even after getting 25 bonus damage in 7.2, just didn't pack a big enough punch in the early game to warrant being a first purchase, and if you wanted to fully optimize the value of this item, you had to build full lethality, consequently making you extremely squishy, and with the item encouraging multiple procs of Night Stalker over just one, there was almost no chance you would survive longer than a rotation or two. So just like the first iteration, the second iteration of Duskblade suffered from being somewhat counterintuitive. It was certainly more practical than its predecessor, especially with the added vision denial, but as a combat item, which Duskblade was intended to be in the first place, it had a passive that gave off the impression of being best applied for dueling scenarios, continuously entering and exiting stealth to refresh the passive for more damage, and yet to scale the damage you had to dedicate all inventory slots to lethality items, reducing the efficiency of Duskblade if you tried to go for any purchases without the stat in question. To alleviate this, enter Duskblade 3, leveling its gold cost and build path to match that of Ghostblade. Now, instead of dealing true damage that scaled off lethality, it would do physical damage that scaled on level, and it would apply a heavy, albeit short-lasting slow with each activation, finally addressing Duskblade 2's main problems, being how bad of a first item purchase it was in regards to cost and build path, and having a scaling component that can only improve with more items. By changing the damage formula to scale based on level, it meant that even if Duskblade was a sole lethality item you purchased, it would still scale rather well. The 99% slow also gave us some much needed front-loaded pressure, since even though it only lasts for a quarter of a second, that bit of time may be just enough to land a critical skill shot like Rengar Bola, Cossacks Void Spike, or Zed Shurikens, finally giving Duskblade a proper niche as a combat-oriented first strike assassin item. Unfortunately, however, in fixing one problem, they created more. With Duskblade now having a comfortable build path, self-contained scaling, and providing all the essential stats in attack damage, cooldown reduction, and lethality, it became too general of an item, especially when factoring in the vision denial, which is still a very powerful tool to have. It took all but no time for Ryze to realize they were too generous with the bonus damage, resulting in a hotfix nerf to the item not too long after the patch came out. It appears that wasn't sufficient, as the very next patch, the base damage got nerfed once again, measurably more for ranged champions in addition to no longer having the brief slow for them, since I believe champions like Misfortune and Jhin were abusing that a little too well. Now, Season 8 also marked the beginning of an underlying meta that still permeates the game even to this day. The one-shot meta, where it feels like everyone does billions of damage and no amount of health or armor will save you. Duskblade became one of the biggest defenders of this, and in version 8.6 they severely nerfed the bonus on hit damage, but as a consolation, melee basic attacks would now instantly clear wards, making the utility part of Duskblade more significant. The item would continue throughout the better part of Season 8 without incident, but throughout that time it was still evident that Duskblade was spearheading the one-shot meta too hard, especially in tandem with burst moves like Electrocute, Cheap Shot, and Sudden Impact, all three of which getting nerfed in 8.16. One version later, in 8.17, Duskblade lost even more damage on Night Stalker but gained a small amount of lethality, so from the beginning of Duskblade 3 to the end of it, Night Stalker's damage went from 105 to 360 all the way down to 30 to 150, losing almost 2/3 of its effective power at max level, highlighting just how pervasive the damage meta was and still is when an item can basically lose half its power and still be considered broken. Duskblade was allowed to get away with that much damage back then in light of items being the primary source of damage, but then when Runes Reforged came in, as well as a few other systems changes, everyone started doing way more damage than they ever have before, forcing Ryze to slash the damage on Duskblade to compensate, and even then, it was still too good of an item. So in pre-season 10, they took away the Blackout passive and gave it to the newly added Umbral Glaive, meaning if you wanted to get both combat stats and macro utility, you had to build two separate items, though as another consolation, Duskblade got 5 extra AD. The consequence of all these changes and adjustments, however, made Duskblade lose its original purpose. Back then, it was reserved almost exclusively for assassins. Now though, it became too general of an item. Losing the Blackout passive took away the whole stealth nature to it, trading movement speed for cooldown reduction, a more universally applicable stat, and changing Night Stalker's damage from scaling off lethality to flash scaling has made it so many champions were building it. You would occasionally see it on fighters, marksmen. I remember even one time there was Duskblade Irelia before she got reworked. That was the time. Basically, anyone who even remotely possessed front-loaded damage could abuse this item to high heaven. It went from being a niche assassin item to a general burst item, hence why the Night Stalker damage got nerfed so many times too. When your next attack just did an extra 300 damage for free, literally anyone can take advantage of that. Now we arrive at Duskblade 4, coinciding with the Mythic item system in Preseason 11. It still retained its Night Stalker passive, dealing bonus damage on your next basic attack and applying a heavy but short-lasting slow. Now though, instead of refreshing its cooldown whenever breaking enemy vision, it was given a flat 15-second cooldown that could reset on champion takedown. Speaking of champion takedowns, Duskblade's new effect granted 1.5 seconds of invisibility as well. The idea was that assassins could make use of the invisibility to buy time to get in and out of fights, and while that certainly delivered on it, ironically, the champions that benefited from Duskblade the most were non-assassins. You guys may remember during early Season 11 the rise of Duskblade Master Yi panic killing everyone while being impossible to hit, Duskblade Samira going stealth so you couldn't catch her after she triple killed your backline, Duskblade Hecarim so you can run your team down and disappear as quickly as you charged in, or why the hell not, Duskblade motherfucking Nasus. That's when you know all hell broke loose, when even Nasus went beside him. To say that Duskblade was still a problematic item was an understatement. It was by no means as meta-altering as some of the other mythics like Turbo Chemtank, Stridebreaker, Goredrinker, Everfrost, Sunfire and whatnot, but it definitely wasn't contributing any healthy gameplay aspects to League either. The ability to give any champion invisibility, namely those who were never balanced around the possibility of having it, was just a recipe for disaster that gave rise to so many cheesy strategies during this time. So, almost like deja vu, Duskblade had to get nerfed so as to reduce how all-purpose of an item it was. Night Stalker lost a ton of base damage in version 11.1, finally bringing it to a point of normalcy. But surprisingly enough, it was actually kind of weak for most of Season 11, especially on melee champions, considering many of them were actually rushing Goredrinker first item, which, due to the 15% bonus AD based on missing health component plus the active effect, just made it an overall more cost-effective and efficient item to build. So in 11.23, they actually buffed it, giving more base damage and a cheaper gold cost, while at the same time nerfing it for ranged champions so as to maintain its current efficiency for them. Stat-wise, Duskblade was in a decent position for 2022, but it was evident that the invisibility thing continuously refreshing off kills was a problem in regards to snowballing. Prowler's Claw was too niche of an item for most assassins, as the majority of them already had the means to gap close on targets, so instead it was primarily used on champions who needed a quick way in like Rek'Sai or Renekton, not so much a class it was originally intended for. And while Eclipse was definitely serviceable, it was better suited for champions with short trades like Pantheon, not really assassins who focused on 100 to 0ing you off a single interaction. Lastly, we have Duskblade 5, the fifth, final, and most offensive version of this godforsaken item. Instead of having bonus damage on your next basic attack, this version of Duskblade increased your total damage against targets based on their missing health, and in an attempt to preserve the same feel of Duskblade 4 while making it a bit healthier, they had the genius idea of making it so scoring a takedown on a champion gave 1.5 seconds of untargetability and invincibility. Yes, this is truly a group of intellectuals with a strong grasp of their mental faculties. They tried to balance this by letting it realistically only activate once in a single fight, but 1.5 seconds of untargetability and invincibility. This means you can't rely on the last tick of Ignite or AoE damage finishing off a low health Master Yi, Graves, Aatrox, Hecarim, or Samira. Also, typically, one resets all these guys need to steamroll all over you. So with this new abomination of a passive in tandem with being able to deal tons of extra damage by existing, and Duskblade, yet again, completely lost sight of its original purpose as a niche but effective assassin item, becoming a near best-in-slot first purchase item for anyone who remotely wanted to build AD. Divers, assassins, skirmishers, marksmen, almost every DPS class had someone or many champions who not only could, but oftentimes wanted to build this item. The remainder of Season 13 oversaw Duskblade's invincibility cooldown triple in duration as a result of the balance team failing to realize in the beginning that giving untargetability and invulnerability to snowball-oriented champs is an ill-advised decision to say the least. And after a long, inglorious, and tumultuous tenure of 8 years, it was retired in version 14.1. Duskblade's not iconic for being the most meta-breaking item like Banner of Command or Ardent Censer, nor was it the most overpowered item in the game. It's iconic for going through 5 separate, fairly distinct iterations, all of which failing in some way, shape, or form, and yet somehow, instead of each one being better than the one that came before, it was almost as if each one was worse than the one that came before. I think this picture sums up exactly how I feel about this item. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's dive into the past. Let me know your thoughts on Duskblade in the comments down below, including which version you think was the quote-unquote healthiest. Aside from that, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other history videos if you haven't yet. But as always, till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.